Here we have one of Mercedes' more famous models. This car, when it came out, was a bit of a revolution. It was technologically advanced for its time. Many years later, it's still quite an appealing car to look at. It's certainly very attractive. I wouldn't say the interior is quite as pretty as the outside. It's certainly got a retro feel. Immediately pops out is this very cheap, tacky looking plastic, tacky veneer that makes up the center console. It really is quite awful, and it's a sort of plastic that's reminiscent in a horrible old British Leyland from years ago. It really doesn't sit too well in a Mercedes. Actually, the center console really is quite an ugly part of the car's interior altogether. Dashboard's quite sleek. Doesn't feel like a cheap and nasty plastic, but there is plenty of nasty plastic around, which surprises me because this was a very expensive car when it came out. The instrument cluster here, which has a lot of dials on, 5 in fact, majority of it is obstructed by the steering wheel. Now okay, I can adjust the steering wheel no problem, but the whole idea of that is to get the right driving position, not to be able to see the instrument dial. So a lot of the time you are like this, trying to see what's going. Don't like the steering on this car, very vague. I mean, we are dealing with a car that's done over 100,000 miles, so you're going to have to expect some wear and tear, but that doesn't feel too good to me, and it's not the sort of response I would like of a sports car. Now if I give the whole car a shake like this, much to my surprise, the car really meanders like a sidewinder and boats all over the place. That's not at all what I was anticipating from this car. I thought the car would be rock hard, solid, very firm shocks, but that's not the case. In fact, as I go down the road now, the car is almost undulating, in many ways like a Citroen. So this car is not at all what one would expect, I think. Now the rear view vision is actually very, very good. There's absolutely no obstructions at all, and even though there are 2 seats in the back, unless you were about 2 years old, you wouldn't be able to use them. The wing mirrors, on the other hand, are quite large, except for that one which is broken. They are quite large, so there's no problem seeing where you've been. The driving position is good. It's a fully laid back position. You certainly do feel like you're in an enthusiastic car. Now the car has done over 100,000 miles, so we are dealing with a car which basically at the end of the day would probably need all the bushes underneath changed and a genuine big overhaul. Maybe not on the engine, but certainly on the rest of the car. But the brakes on this car don't feel like a usual high standard Mercedes, that big balanced hydraulic system where all the gears work in perfect harmony. It doesn't seem to be working that way. The engine is quiet, there's not a lot of noise going on here. In fact, the only noise I can hear is from the outside. When these came out, one of the reasons why they were famous is because the roll bar was said to pop up quicker than somebody could blink. And at the time that was impressive. I'm not too sure whether it would sit too well now, but it's still a good looking car. And let's see what it does for a 0 to 60 test. I think we owe it to ourselves, because nothing else in this car has added up to my expectations so far. 0 to 60 tests. Well, to be fair, I think the car sounded a lot better than it performed. This is by no means a fast Mercedes, and unfortunately this particular model that I'm test driving and reviewing, I think it's fair to say it's a pretty warm model. The mileage may not be that high or that excessive for one of these cars. I suppose Mercedes 100,000 miles is nothing, but it certainly has been a bit of a disappointment for me. I've heard many people say over the years that you should never meet your idol. You should never meet the rock star that you've been buying the records and albums of for the last 20 years. This car has always been at the back of my mind. It's always been a car that I wanted to drive, and I have to say it's been very disappointing. It's been disappointing performance-wise, stability-wise is dreadful. I mean, it really is. And the only thing I still think about this car now after driving it is it looks good on the outside. But there's nothing different about this car and driving a 1980s Alfa Romeo. It really isn't that good, I'm afraid. So anybody thinking about buying one of these, you do have some options with these cars. There are much more powerful engines, and I would say to you, I would forget about this model and really go for something that's got some balls, because this thing just does not have any guts. It's not responsive, and I certainly wouldn't want to drive a high-powered version of one of these with a car that boats and swings around like this. So you're going to have to do your homework, and you're going to have to do your research on this one, because they're really, really, really quite a disappointment at the end of the day.